Lila had always imagined her life would be ordinary. Raised in a quiet town, she lived modestly, working as a translator for a small publishing house. Her days were predictable, punctuated by late-night tea and well-worn novels, but deep inside, she yearned for something extraordinary, something more than the grey monotony of her routine. She dreamed of romance, of adventure, of a life that shimmered with possibilities. It all began on a sweltering summer evening. Lila had been invited to a cultural exchange event in Dubai, a rare perk of her job. She was hesitant at first. This world of opulence and grandeur felt far removed from her quiet existence. But when she stepped off the plane and into the bustling, glittering city, she felt a strange pull, as if destiny had finally decided to intervene. The event was hosted in a lavish ballroom, its ceilings adorned with crystal chandeliers that sparkled like a starry sky. Guests in designer gowns mingled with an ease that made Lila feel small and out of place. She clutched her glass of champagne, wishing she had declined the invitation. That was when she saw him. He stood at the center of the room, a commanding figure draped in an impeccably tailored black suit. His presence was magnetic, drawing the gaze of everyone around him. The whispers began before Lila could even ask who he was. Sheikh Amir al-Hadi, someone murmured behind her. Royal blood. One of the wealthiest men in the Gulf. He owns half of this city. Lila was entranced. His eyes, dark, piercing, and enigmatic, met hers across the room. It was as if he could see right through her, peeling back her insecurities and exposing her soul. She looked away, embarrassed by her sudden flush, but before she could disappear into the crowd, he was standing before her. "You look like someone who doesn't belong here," he said, his voice smooth and deep, with an accent that hinted at privilege and refinement. Lila laughed nervously. "Is it that obvious?" "Not in a bad way," he replied, his lips curling into a faint smile. "It's refreshing." They talked for hours that night, the world around them fading into a blur. Amir was charming, intelligent, and surprisingly down-to-earth. He spoke of his love for poetry, his fascination with history, and his desire to use his wealth for good. He listened intently when Lila spoke, making her feel seen in a way she never had before. By the end of the evening, he had asked for her number, and against her better judgment, she gave it to him. The days that followed felt like a dream. Amir swept Lila off her feet with grand gestures and heartfelt words. He sent her flowers every morning, each bouquet accompanied by a handwritten note. He took her on helicopter rides over the city, dinners in private gardens, and moonlit walks along secluded beaches. Lila fell fast and hard. How could she not? Amir was everything she had ever wished for, a man who seemed to understand her in ways no one else could, a man who made her feel special in a world that had always overlooked her. But even in the midst of her happiness, there were moments of unease. Amir was a private man, his life shrouded in mystery. He never spoke of his past or his family, deflecting her questions with charm and wit. He was often guarded, his eyes clouding over when she pressed too hard. "Some things are better left in the past," he would say, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Focus on the present, Lila. Focus on us." And so, she did. She silenced the nagging doubts in her mind, convincing herself that every love story had its mysteries. But deep down, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that Amir was hiding something. The first crack in his perfect facade appeared one evening when they were walking through the souk. A man, rough-looking and wild-eyed, approached Amir with a mix of fear and anger. "You think you can ignore me forever?" The man spat, his voice low and venomous. "You think I don't know what you've done?" Amir's expression darkened, his usual composure replaced by something colder, more dangerous. "Leave," he said, his voice like steel. The man hesitated, his gaze darting to Lila. "He's not who you think he is," he warned before disappearing into the crowd. Lila was shaken, but Amir dismissed the encounter as the ramblings of a disgruntled ex-employee. "He's just trying to stir up trouble," he assured her. "Don't let it bother you." She nodded, forcing herself to believe him. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew with each passing day. One night, as she lay in Amir's arms, Lila couldn't help but wonder if she had been too quick to trust him. She thought of the man in the souk, of Amir's evasiveness, and of the shadow that sometimes crossed his face when he thought she wasn't looking. Who was Amir al-Hadi, really? And what secrets was he hiding behind that charming smile? The days that followed her encounter with Amir felt like stepping into a fairy tale. For the first time in her life, Lila wasn't just living, she was thriving. Her once simple world was now adorned with luxuries she had only read about in glossy magazines. Mornings began with breakfast on sprawling terraces overlooking the glimmering city skyline, where Amir would read poetry aloud to her in his deep, honeyed voice. Afternoons were spent exploring corners of Dubai she never knew existed, from exclusive art galleries to hidden pearl diving sites. Amir's attention to detail was unmatched. He remembered the smallest things, how she preferred her tea slightly sweetened, how her favorite flowers were lavender, and how she loved the sound of the ocean. He tailored their days to her whims, painting her life in vibrant colors she didn't know she needed. For Lila, it was intoxicating. Their relationship grew quickly, but naturally, as if the universe itself had orchestrated their meeting. She learned to navigate the world of extravagance that came with being Amir's partner. Lavish parties, designer gowns, and whispered introductions to royalty became her new reality. She felt like Cinderella at the ball, except her prince wasn't going anywhere when the clock struck midnight. But as much as she tried to immerse herself in this new life, there were moments where she felt like an outsider. The opulence was overwhelming, and the people Amir surrounded himself with, though polished and gracious, often carried an air of superiority. Lila's humble upbringing became a sharp contrast to the gilded world she now occupied. "Do you ever feel suffocated?" she asked Amir one evening as they walked along the beach. The moon hung low in the sky, its reflection shimmering on the waves. "Suffocated?" he chuckled, slipping his hand into hers. "What makes you say that?" "It's just, everything is so big, so grand. It's like this world doesn't leave room for anything simple." Amir paused, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Simplicity can be beautiful, Lila," he said softly, "but sometimes, it's not enough. Sometimes, the world demands more." His words lingered in her mind, even as she nodded and smiled, pretending to understand. Their love seemed perfect, but little inconsistencies began to surface. Amir was often pulled away for business, and while he always returned with gifts and apologies, Lila couldn't ignore the vague explanations. She noticed the furtive glances between him and his assistants, the hushed conversations that abruptly stopped when she entered the room. Once, while exploring the sprawling villa he owned just outside the city, she stumbled upon a locked door. It was the only room in the house she hadn't seen, and her curiosity got the better of her. "What's in there?" she asked later that evening, trying to sound casual. Amir's smile faltered for the briefest of moments before he recovered. "Just storage," he replied, waving it off. "Old family things. Nothing interesting." But his tone was too dismissive, too forced. Lila couldn't shake the feeling that the door hid more than just dusty heirlooms. Despite these moments of doubt, Amir continued to shower her with love and attention. He introduced her to his closest friends, powerful men and women who seemed to respect him deeply, almost fearfully. At parties, they would toast to his successes, speaking in hushed tones about his unparalleled ambition and his ability to handle challenges with precision. Lila didn't understand half of what they were referring to, but she was too enamored to care. She saw only the man who recited Neruda poems to her, who kissed her forehead like it was the most sacred thing in the world, who held her hand as if he never wanted to let go. And yet, the cracks continued to form. One evening, after an extravagant dinner party, Lila returned to the villa feeling drained. Amir was in his study, attending to business as usual, and she decided to take a walk around the property. The night air was cool, the faint scent of jasmine lingering as she strolled through the gardens. Her wanderings brought her back to the locked door. This time, she lingered. She traced her fingers along the handle, tempted to press her ear against the wood. She knew it was irrational. Amir had told her it was just storage, but something about the door felt wrong, as if it didn't belong in a house filled with light and beauty. The sound of footsteps startled her, and she spun around to find Amir watching her. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice calm but his eyes sharp. "I was just exploring," she replied, her heart pounding. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You should rest, Lila. It's late." He guided her back to their room, his grip on her arm gentle but firm. That night, she barely slept, her mind racing with questions she didn't dare ask. The next morning, Amir surprised her with tickets to a private island getaway. "I've been too busy lately," he admitted, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I want to make it up to you." The island was paradise. Pristine beaches, turquoise waters, and a villa that felt like it was carved from the heavens. Amir was attentive and affectionate, his usual intensity softened by the tranquility of their surroundings. For a while, Lila allowed herself to forget her doubts. She told herself she was overthinking, that Amir was simply a man who valued his privacy. But even as she lay in his arms, listening to the soothing crash of waves, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that her life was too perfect, too fragile, as if it might shatter at any moment. The illusion of bliss began to crumble one night when she woke to find Amir gone. The villa was silent, the faint hum of the ocean the only sound. She wandered through the house, calling his name, but there was no answer. Eventually, she found him outside, standing on the beach, his phone pressed to his ear. He was speaking in a language she didn't understand, his tone low and urgent. When he noticed her, he ended the call abruptly, slipping the phone into his pocket. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice light but his expression guarded. "I was looking for you," she said, trying to mask her unease. "Is everything okay?" "Of course," he replied, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Go back to bed, my love. I'll join you soon." But as they walked back to the villa, Lila couldn't ignore the tension in his posture, the way he glanced over his shoulder as if expecting someone or something to appear. The perfect life Amir had crafted for her was beginning to feel like a gilded cage. The luxury, the romance, the fairy tale, it all felt like a facade, hiding something dark and dangerous. Lila wanted to believe in the man she had fallen in love with. But deep down, she knew the time had come to face the truth. Whatever Amir was hiding, it was only a matter of time before it came to light. Lila couldn't ignore it anymore, the lingering doubts, the strange encounters, and the unsettling feeling of walking on a thin sheet of ice, it all gnawed at her. Amir's world was breathtaking, but it was also suffocating, its beauty concealing shadows she couldn't yet see. It started with small things. The hushed whispers between Amir and his assistants, the cryptic phone calls in the dead of night, and his sudden disappearances with flimsy excuses. Lila tried to brush it off, to convince herself that everyone had their secrets, but deep down, the questions piled up. Who was Amir when she wasn't around? The tipping point came one evening when Amir received a package at the villa. It was delivered by a man who looked more like a bodyguard than a courier, tall, broad-shouldered, and with a sharp gaze that didn't linger on her for long. Lila watched from the balcony as Amir took the package, his expression unreadable. He disappeared into his study and didn't emerge for hours. Her curiosity was too much to bear. When he finally left the house for a late-night meeting, she slipped into the study. The package was gone, but his desk was cluttered with papers, maps, documents in Arabic, and photographs of people she didn't recognize. Her fingers hovered over one of the photos, her heart racing. A man's face stared back at her. He looked terrified, his eyes wide with fear. Lila flipped the photo over and saw a date scrawled on the back. It was from 2 months ago, before she had even met Amir. What was this? Who was this man? And why did Amir have his photo? Lila's stomach twisted as she dug deeper, careful not to disturb the papers too much. She found a letter in Arabic, its handwriting rushed and uneven. Though her Arabic was basic, she could make out a few words: debt, threat, and a name she didn't recognize. The realization hit her like a cold wave. Amir wasn't just a businessman. He was involved in something far darker, something dangerous. She decided to confront him, but when Amir returned home, his charm was disarming. He kissed her forehead, held her close, and spoke about plans for their future. His warmth felt genuine, but Lila couldn't shake the image of the man in the photo or the cryptic letter she'd found. "Amir," she began cautiously as they lay in bed that night, "what kind of business are you involved in?" He turned to her, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "Why do you ask?" "I'm just curious," she said, forcing a smile. "You're always so busy, and I barely know anything about what you do." Amir studied her for a moment before answering. "I deal in investments, real estate, and trade. It's complicated, but nothing you need to worry about." His answer was too smooth, too rehearsed. Lila nodded, pretending to be satisfied, but the doubt festered. Her opportunity came a week later when Amir left for a business trip. With the villa to herself, she decided to dig deeper. She searched his study, his private library, and even his bedroom, but everything seemed carefully curated to reveal nothing. Then she remembered the locked room. The door loomed before her, a silent challenge. She hesitated, knowing that what lay beyond it could change everything. Her heart pounded as she tried the handle. It was locked, as always. But Amir's keyring sat on his desk, and after some fumbling, she found the key that fit. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room filled with filing cabinets, safes, and monitors displaying live footage of various locations. Lila's breath hitched as she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the shelves lined with binders and folders. She pulled out the nearest binder and opened it. Inside were documents detailing financial transactions, large sums of money being transferred to offshore accounts, some under aliases she didn't recognize. But what sent chills down her spine were the names. The same name from the letter she had found was listed repeatedly, alongside others, with notes like neutralized and pending resolution. Her hands shook as she flipped through the pages, each one more damning than the last. Amir wasn't just a businessman. He was running an empire built on lies, manipulation, and, if the documents were to be believed, violence. Before she could process what she'd found, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from an unknown number. "You're in over your head. Stop before it's too late." Lila froze, the phone slipping from her hands. Someone was watching her. She slammed the binder shut and locked the door behind her, her mind racing. Who had sent the message? How did they know what she was doing? And what would happen if Amir found out? That night, she barely slept. Every creak of the villa, every whisper of the wind, felt like a threat. The image of the terrified man in the photo haunted her, as did the cryptic words in the letter. She realized she couldn't trust anyone, not even Amir. The following morning, she made a decision. She needed answers, and the only way to get them was to confront the people connected to Amir's secrets. She started with the name from the letter, searching online for any trace of him. What she found chilled her to the bone. The man had gone missing weeks ago, his family pleading for answers in local news reports. Lila knew she was treading dangerous waters, but she couldn't stop. She began piecing together the fragments of Amir's world, following the threads wherever they led. Each discovery painted a darker picture of the man she thought she loved. The final straw came when she stumbled upon a news article buried deep in an obscure blog. It detailed an accidental fire at a factory owned by one of Amir's companies. The article mentioned casualties, workers who had allegedly been locked inside during the fire. The official story blamed faulty wiring, but the blog hinted at foul play, claiming the factory had been targeted for refusing to pay a debt. Lila felt sick. The man she had fallen in love with was not just secretive, he was dangerous. He had blood on his hands, and she was living under the same roof as him. She knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. But the question remained, what would she do with what she knew? And more importantly, how far would Amir go to keep his secrets buried? Lila's world crumbled the moment she accepted the truth about Amir. The man she had fallen for, who had swept her off her feet with grand gestures and tender words, wasn't just hiding secrets, he was the architect of a web of deception and destruction. Her hands trembled as she held her phone, scrolling through the article about the factory fire. She couldn't unsee the images of the charred building or the tear-streaked faces of grieving families demanding justice. The blog claimed that Amir's involvement in the incident wasn't just tangential, it was central. The factory owner, a man who had dared to cross Amir, had been made an example of. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Amir wasn't just a wealthy and powerful man. He was a predator, willing to destroy lives to maintain his empire. That night, as she lay in bed beside him, she watched his chest rise and fall with each breath. The warmth of his body, once a source of comfort, now felt suffocating. She could barely reconcile the two versions of him in her mind, the man who held her like she was the center of his world and the man who orchestrated chaos in the shadows. She thought back to the first night they met, the charm in his smile, the way he had made her feel like she was the only person in the room. It was all a lie, she realized. A carefully constructed illusion meant to reel her in. But why? Why had he chosen her? Over the following days, Lila began to piece together the fragments of Amir's double life. She stayed cautious, careful not to arouse his suspicion. While he attended meetings and lavish parties, she stayed behind, poring over the documents she had secretly photographed from the locked room. The picture that emerged was chilling. Amir's wealth wasn't built on legitimate business deals, it was built on exploitation, coercion, and violence. He controlled a vast network of businesses, many of which were fronts for illegal operations, money laundering, arms deals, and even human trafficking. Lila's stomach churned as she uncovered more. Each discovery was worse than the last. Names and faces haunted her, people who had crossed Amir and paid the price. The man from the photo, the one whose terrified eyes had burned into her memory, had been one of them. He had been a whistleblower, a former employee who had tried to expose Amir's operations. His disappearance had been no accident. And now, Lila knew too much. One evening, as Amir prepared for yet another business trip, she decided to test the waters. "Where are you headed this time?" she asked, keeping her tone light. "Just some meetings in Riyadh," he replied, adjusting his cufflinks. "You're always working," she said with a small laugh. "Don't you ever get tired?" Amir smiled, his gaze softening as he walked over to her. "I do it for us, Lila, to give you the life you deserve." His words, once so comforting, now felt like a threat. After Amir left, Lila decided it was time to act. She couldn't live with the weight of what she knew. The guilt of staying silent, of turning a blind eye to Amir's crimes, was unbearable. She reached out to the only person she thought could help, a journalist whose name had appeared in several of the exposés she had read. The journalist, a woman named Yasmin, had spent years investigating corruption in the region. Lila found her email on the blog and sent a message, detailing everything she had discovered. Hours felt like days as she waited for a response. She jumped at every sound, her paranoia growing with each passing moment. Finally, an email arrived. "Meet me tomorrow at 10 a.m. Café Al Noor. Come alone." Lila's hands shook as she read the message. This was it, the first step toward exposing Amir. The next morning, she arrived at the café early, her heart pounding. She scanned the room, looking for Yasmin. A woman in her 40s with piercing eyes and a confident demeanor approached her. "Lila," she nodded, and Yasmin gestured for her to sit. "Tell me everything," Yasmin said, pulling out a notebook. Lila poured her heart out, recounting everything she had discovered. The documents, the locked room, the factory fire, the missing whistleblower, it all spilled out. Yasmin listened intently, her expression growing darker with every word. "This is bigger than I thought," Yasmin said finally. "Amir Al-Farouk has been on our radar for years, but we've never had enough evidence to bring him down. What you have could change that." Lila felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished by Yasmin's next words. "But you're in danger. If Amir finds out what you're doing." She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Over the next few days, Lila worked with Yasmin to gather more evidence. She pretended everything was normal around Amir, smiling and laughing as if her world wasn't crumbling. But the facade was exhausting. Every moment she spent with him felt like a game of Russian roulette. One evening, as they sat on the terrace overlooking the city, Amir took her hand. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his eyes searching hers. "Just tired," she replied, forcing a smile. Amir studied her for a moment, his gaze piercing. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" "Of course," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But she couldn't tell him the truth. She couldn't tell him that she knew who he really was, that she was working to bring him down. The turning point came when Yasmin called her in a panic. "They know," Yasmin said, her voice trembling. "Someone's been following me. They know we're working together." Lila's blood ran cold. She had underestimated Amir's reach, his ability to control and manipulate. "Should we stop?" Lila asked, her voice shaking. "No," Yasmin said firmly. "We're too close. But you need to be careful. He won't let you go easily." Lila hung up, her mind racing. She realized she couldn't wait any longer. She needed to make her move before Amir discovered her betrayal. That night, as Amir slept beside her, she slipped out of bed and retrieved the documents she had hidden. She packed a small bag, her hands trembling as she worked. She knew she might never see him again. A part of her mourned the loss of the man she had loved, but she reminded herself that he was an illusion, a mask hiding a monster. As she slipped out of the villa, the weight of her decision pressed down on her. She was leaving behind the life she had known, stepping into the unknown. But she couldn't turn back now. Lila knew the moment she stepped out of the villa that there was no turning back. The documents she carried were enough to expose Amir's dark empire, but they were also a death sentence if he found out she had them. Every shadow felt like a pair of eyes, every sound like footsteps creeping closer. She didn't go directly to Yasmin. Instead, she made several stops, switching cars and taking winding routes through the city to shake off anyone who might be following her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she finally arrived at Yasmin's safe house, a small, unassuming apartment on the outskirts of the city. Yasmin greeted her with a mix of relief and urgency. "Did anyone follow you?" "I don't think so," Lila replied, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. Yasmin led her inside, locking the door behind them. The room was cluttered with papers, maps, and a corkboard covered in photos and notes. In the center of it all was Amir's face, a reminder of the man who had once been her whole world. "We don't have much time," Yasmin said. "If Amir realizes you're gone, he'll come after you." Lila nodded, her hands trembling as she handed over the documents. "This is everything I could get. It's enough, isn't it?" Yasmin flipped through the files, her expression grim. "It's enough to destroy him, but it's also enough to make you his biggest target." As they worked late into the night, piecing together the evidence, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her phone buzzed, and her heart dropped when she saw the message. "You've made a mistake, Lila. Come home, and we'll fix this." It was from Amir. Her blood ran cold. He knew. "Yasmin," she whispered, showing her the message. Yasmin's face hardened. "He's trying to manipulate you. Don't respond." But Lila's hands shook as she stared at the screen. She could feel his presence through the words, his calm and calculated tone masking the storm beneath. Amir wasn't the type to let betrayal go unanswered. The next message came minutes later. "You can't run from me. You know that, don't you?" Lila felt like the walls were closing in. She glanced at Yasmin, who was already packing up the documents. "We need to move," Yasmin said. "He's trying to scare you, but we can't let him win." As they prepared to leave, the lights in the apartment flickered. Lila's stomach dropped as the sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. "He's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Yasmin grabbed her arm. "Stay calm. There's a back exit." But before they could move, the door burst open, and two of Amir's men stormed in. They were tall and imposing, their dark suits barely concealing the weapons at their sides. "Miss Lila," one of them said, his voice cold. "Amir would like to see you." Lila's heart raced as Yasmin stepped in front of her. "She's not going anywhere," Yasmin said firmly. The man smirked. "I wasn't asking." Before Lila could react, one of the men grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. Yasmin tried to intervene, but the other man shoved her aside. "Yasmin!" Lila screamed, struggling against the iron grip on her arm. "It's okay." Yasmin called after her. "Don't let him break you." They drove her back to the villa in silence, the tension in the car suffocating. Lila's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out, but she knew she was out of options. Amir had the upper hand now. When they arrived, she was escorted into the grand sitting room where Amir waited. He stood by the fireplace, his back to her, his posture calm and composed. "Leave us," he said without turning around. The men obeyed, closing the doors behind them. Lila stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as Amir finally turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with intensity. "You've been busy," he said, his voice calm but laced with menace. Amir took a step closer, his footsteps eerily quiet on the marble floor. His calm demeanor was more terrifying than any outburst could have been. "And what do you plan to do with this truth you've uncovered, Lila?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. Lila's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stand her ground. "I've already given everything to someone who can expose you. It's over, Amir." At that, his faint smile vanished. His expression hardened, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You think you can destroy me? That you can bring down everything I've built?" "I don't think," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I know." Amir's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. For a moment, she thought he might lash out, but then he laughed, a low, bitter sound that sent chills down her spine. "You think you're the first person to try and take me down," he said, his tone mocking. "Do you have any idea who I am? What I'm capable of?" "I do now," she replied, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her chest. "And I'm not afraid of you." Amir's laughter stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. He closed the distance between them in 2 swift strides, his face inches from hers. "You should be," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lila's heart pounded as she stared into his eyes, the man she had once loved now a stranger. For the first time, she realized just how dangerous he truly was. What did you think was going to happen, Lila? Amir asked, circling her like a predator stalking its prey. That you could betray me and walk away unscathed. She didn't answer, her mind racing for an escape plan. I gave you everything, he continued, his voice filled with a cold fury. A life most people can only dream of. And this is how you repay me. You gave me a life built on lies. Lila shot back. You used me, Amir. Just like you use everyone else. His eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. You're playing a very dangerous game. So are you, she retorted. Amir stepped back, his expression shifting to one of calculated control. You know, I could make all of this go away, he said. The journalist, the documents, your little rebellion, it could all disappear with one phone call. All you have to do is stop this madness and come back to me. Lila shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I can't. Not after what I've seen, not after what I know. His face hardened again, the tenderness gone. Then you've left me no choice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, dialing a number. Lila's stomach twisted as she realized what he was doing. Stop, she cried, lunging forward. But it was too late. Handle the journalist, Amir said into the phone, his voice cold and detached. No. Lila screamed, grabbing his arm. Leave her out of this. Amir shoved her away, his strength overpowering her. You don't get to make demands, Lila. Not anymore. Lila's mind raced as she struggled to think of a way to stop him. She couldn't let him hurt Yasmin or anyone else. She spotted a vase on the nearby table and grabbed it, smashing it against the floor to create a distraction. Amir turned toward the noise, and in that split second, Lila darted for his phone. She wrestled it from his hand, but he was quicker, grabbing her wrist and twisting it until she cried out in pain. You're only making this worse for yourself, he growled. Lila gritted her teeth, refusing to back down. You can't control me anymore, Amir. I'm not afraid of you. His grip tightened, but she met his gaze with defiance. For a moment, they were locked in a battle of wills, neither willing to back down. Finally, Amir let go, his expression unreadable. You've made your choice, he said, his tone icy. Now you'll live with the consequences. Amir's words hung in the air as he walked away, leaving her standing alone in the grand, suffocating room. Lila's chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, her body trembling from the confrontation. She knew this was far from over. She had challenged Amir, exposed his darkness, and taken a stand. But she also knew that the war was just beginning and the price of her defiance might be higher than she ever imagined. The echo of Amir's footsteps faded, but Lila's heart still thundered in her chest. She could feel the weight of his parting words pressing down on her. You've made your choice. Now you'll live with the consequences. She didn't doubt him for a second. Amir was a man who thrived on control, a puppeteer pulling strings in a world he had carefully constructed. And now, she was the thread unraveling his empire. Lila's breaths came in short, panicked gasps as she realized the gravity of her situation. She was no longer a lover to Amir, she was a liability, a threat. He wouldn't stop until she was silenced. She couldn't stay in the villa. The walls that once felt luxurious and protective now loomed like a gilded cage. Her only hope was to run, but where? His influence extended beyond borders, his network vast and loyal. Still, she couldn't let fear paralyze her. She had come too far to give up now. The first step was to get to Yasmin. If Amir's men had already been dispatched, she had to warn her. Lila darted into her room, throwing on a dark jacket and grabbing a small bag she had hastily packed earlier. She slipped the burner phone Yasmin had given her into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the edge of the memory card she had hidden inside. That memory card held everything, the files, the names, the accounts, all the evidence that could expose Amir. It was her last bargaining chip, her insurance policy. The villa was eerily quiet as she crept toward the side entrance. She avoided the main halls, her ears straining for any sound of approaching guards. Just as she reached the door, a voice stopped her in her tracks. Going somewhere, Miss Lila? She froze, turning slowly to see one of Amir's men blocking her path. His expression was smug, his posture relaxed, but the gun holstered at his side was anything but casual. Lila forced a smile, her mind racing. I just needed some air. The man's smirk widened. Funny. Amir said you might try to leave. Her pulse quickened. She could see the tension in his stance, the readiness to spring into action at any moment. I wasn't running, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I just needed time to think. The man tilted his head, as if considering her words. Then, without warning, he lunged. Lila reacted instinctively, dodging to the side as he grabbed for her. She stumbled but regained her footing, adrenaline surging through her veins. She had no plan, only the desperate need to escape. The man caught her arm, his grip like iron. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, he growled. But Lila wasn't giving up. She twisted, kicking at his knee with all her strength. He cursed, his grip loosening just enough for her to break free. She ran. The villa's sprawling grounds felt like a labyrinth as she sprinted through the darkness. She could hear the shouts of guards behind her, their voices rising in alarm. She didn't dare look back, her focus solely on reaching the perimeter. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she reached the outer wall. The gate was too heavily guarded, but she remembered the narrow gap she had seen near the garden, a flaw in the otherwise impenetrable fortress. She squeezed through, scraping her arms and tearing her jacket in the process. But she didn't stop. The world beyond the wall was vast and unfamiliar, but it was freedom. For now, Lila ran until her legs burned, until the lights of the villa were nothing but a faint glow in the distance. She found herself in a dense grove of trees, the branches overhead casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. Her burner phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out, her hands shaking as she answered. Lila, Yasmin's voice was urgent. Where are you? I got out, Lila said, her voice trembling. But Amir knows. He sent his men after me. There was a pause, then Yasmin's voice softened. You're brave, Lila, but we're not safe yet. You need to get to the location we discussed. Lila nodded, even though Yasmin couldn't see her. I'm on my way. The next few hours were a blur of narrow escapes and desperate decisions. Lila switched vehicles twice, taking rides from strangers who thankfully didn't ask too many questions. She kept her head down, avoiding security cameras and busy areas. By the time she reached the safe house Yasmin had arranged, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. Her body ached, and her mind was a whirlwind of exhaustion and fear. Yasmin was waiting for her inside, her face a mixture of relief and concern. You made it, she said, pulling Lila into a brief hug. Barely, Lila replied, sinking into a chair. Amir's men are everywhere. I don't know how much longer I can keep running. You won't have to, Yasmin said, her tone determined. We're releasing the story tonight. Once it's out, the world will know who Amir really is. He won't be able to hide anymore. But Lila wasn't convinced. Amir's power wasn't just in his wealth, it was in his ability to manipulate, to intimidate, to silence. What if it's not enough? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yasmin crouched in front of her, meeting her gaze. It will be, because you've done something no one else has dared to do. You've stood up to him. Lila wanted to believe her, but deep down, she knew the fight was far from over. Amir wouldn't go do as night fell, the weight of what she had done pressed down on her. She had exposed a monster, but in doing so, she had painted a target on her back. The darkness outside the safe house felt alive, as if Amir's shadow stretched over every corner of her world. But she refused to let fear consume her. She had come too far to stop now. The fight for survival wasn't over. But for the first time, Lila felt a spark of hope. The air in the safe house felt heavy as Lila sat across from Yasmin, the weight of her decisions pressing on her shoulders. The memory card containing all the evidence rested on the table between them, a small but powerful object that could either save her or destroy her life entirely. Yasmin was typing furiously on her laptop, preparing to upload the damning files to every news outlet, social media platform, and whistleblower site they could think of. But even as they worked, the nagging sense of dread lingered. Amir wouldn't wait for the storm to hit, he would strike first. We'll be ready to release everything in less than an hour, Yasmin said, her voice steady but her hands trembling. Once this goes live, the world will know the truth. Lila nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She knew Amir. He wouldn't let them win without a fight, and he would stop at nothing to keep his empire intact. She had to prepare for the worst. As the clock ticked down, Lila's phone buzzed. The unknown number sent a chill down her spine, but she answered anyway, her heart pounding. You've gone too far, Lila. Amir's voice was cold and sharp, like the blade of a knife. "I've done what I should have done a long time ago," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "You think you can bring me down?" he hissed. "You think the world will care about your so-called evidence? They'll forget in days, and I'll still be standing." "Not this time," Lila said firmly. "This time, you won't be able to hide." There was a long pause on the line before Amir spoke again, his tone menacing. "You've forced my hand, Lila. I warned you not to cross me." The line went dead, and Lila felt her stomach drop. Yasmin looked up from her laptop. "What did he say?" "He's coming," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. Yasmin's face hardened. "Then we have to move faster. Once this is live, he won't have anywhere to hide." But Lila wasn't convinced. Amir had resources, connections, and loyal followers who would do his bidding without question. She couldn't just sit and wait for him to strike. "We need a backup plan," Lila said, pacing the room. "Something that ensures this evidence gets out, even if he finds us." Yasmin nodded, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "I can set up an automatic release. If anything happens to us, the files will still go public." "Do it," Lila said, her voice firm. As Yasmin worked, Lila scanned the safe house for anything they could use to defend themselves. The small space offered little in the way of protection, but she found a heavy metal rod in a storage closet and gripped it tightly. The hours dragged on, every noise outside sending a jolt of fear through Lila's body. She couldn't shake the feeling that Amir's men were closing in, that it was only a matter of time before they found her. Finally, Yasmin looked up, her expression triumphant. "It's done. The files are ready to go live in 20 minutes. Lila felt a flicker of hope. "That's it, then. He can't stop us now." But Yasmin's smile faded as the sound of tires screeching to a halt outside reached their ears. Lila's heart raced as she looked out the window. A fleet of black SUVs had pulled up outside the safe house, their doors opening to reveal a dozen of Amir's men. "They're here," she whispered, gripping the metal rod tighter. Yasmin closed her laptop, her face pale but determined. "We can't let them stop us." Lila nodded, her mind racing. They had to hold them off long enough for the files to go live. The first blow came as the men started pounding on the door. "Open up, or we'll break it down," one of them shouted. Lila and Yasmin exchanged a look, their unspoken understanding clear. They were in this together, no matter what. The door burst open moments later, and chaos erupted. Lila swung the metal rod with all her strength, catching the first man off guard. He stumbled back, clutching his arm, but another one took his place. Yasmin scrambled to secure the laptop, ducking behind a table as the men flooded into the room. "You're not taking us without a fight," Lila shouted, her voice raw with adrenaline. The men were relentless, but so was she. She fought with every ounce of strength she had, refusing to let them win. In the midst of the chaos, a loud ping sounded from Yasmin's laptop. "It's live," Yasmin shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. "The files are out." Lila felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. One of the men lunged at Yasmin, grabbing her by the arm and dragging her toward the door. "Let her go," Lila screamed, charging at him with the metal rod. The man released Yasmin, but not before striking her across the face. She crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Lila's rage boiled over as she fought to protect her friend, her movements fueled by pure determination. The sound of sirens in the distance brought the fight to an abrupt halt. "Police!" someone shouted. Amir's men froze, their confidence faltering. "Let's go," one of them barked, and they retreated as quickly as they had come. Lila dropped the metal rod, her body trembling with exhaustion. She knelt beside Yasmin, gently shaking her. "Yasmin, wake up," she said, her voice cracking. After a moment, Yasmin stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Did we do it?" she asked weakly. Lila nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We did it. It's over." As the police arrived and began questioning them, Lila couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. Amir's empire was crumbling, his secrets exposed to the world. But she knew this was just the beginning of a long journey. She had fought for the truth, and now she had to fight for her future. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. The morning air was crisp, carrying a strange sense of calm after the storm of the previous night. Lila stood at the edge of a bustling city square, her face partially hidden beneath the hood of her jacket. Screens flickered on buildings around her, broadcasting the news she had waited so long to see. Breaking news. Billionaire Sheikh Amir Al-Fayed exposed in shocking scandal, the headlines read, accompanied by images of leaked documents, damning testimonies, and the chaos unraveling within his empire. It was surreal. For months, Amir had seemed untouchable, an unshakable force that dominated everything around him. But now, the cracks in his facade were spreading like wildfire. Lila took a deep breath, the weight on her chest lifting slightly. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was winning. The news anchors continued their reports. The leaked files reveal a web of corruption, human trafficking, and financial crimes spanning multiple countries. Authorities have issued warrants for Amir Al-Fayed's arrest, though his current whereabouts remain unknown. The international community has pledged full cooperation in bringing him to justice. The screen shifted to a press conference where law enforcement officials spoke about the coordinated effort to dismantle Amir's operations. Lila could see the determination in their faces, a stark contrast to the fear she had once felt in her own. Yasmin approached her from behind, her face still bruised but her spirit unbroken. "It's everywhere," she said, her voice tinged with both relief and exhaustion. "They're tearing him apart." Lila nodded, her eyes never leaving the screen. "It's not enough," she said softly. Yasmin frowned. "What do you mean?" "His empire is collapsing. He's lost everything." "Not yet," Lila replied, her tone sharp. "He's still out there, hiding, plotting his next move. He won't stop until he gets revenge. We need to finish this." The next few days were a whirlwind of planning and calculated risk. With the help of Yasmin and her network of whistleblowers, Lila tracked every move Amir's remaining allies made. Slowly but surely, they pieced together his possible location. It wasn't easy. Amir had gone underground, cutting ties with everyone who wasn't absolutely loyal. But Lila knew him too well. She knew he would retreat to one of his private estates, places so remote and fortified that most people wouldn't dare approach. One name kept coming up, an isolated mansion in the mountains, nestled in a region where local law enforcement turned a blind eye to the wealthy. "That's where he'll be," Lila said, her voice firm as she pointed to the map. Yasmin hesitated. "Lila, are you sure about this? The authorities are already closing in on him. You don't have to do this yourself." "Yes, I do," Lila said, her gaze unwavering. "He's hurt too many people, destroyed too many lives. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone he's ever silenced." 2 days later, Lila found herself standing outside the gates of Amir's mountain estate. The sun had set, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. She felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her, but she refused to turn back. This was the moment she had been building toward, the culmination of all the pain, fear, and betrayal she had endured. She slipped through a gap in the perimeter fence, moving silently through the underbrush. The mansion loomed ahead, its lights glowing like a beacon in the darkness. Inside, she knew Amir would be waiting. The first guard she encountered never saw her coming. Lila had learned to move quietly, to use the element of surprise to her advantage. She disarmed him quickly, tying him up and taking his communication device. As she moved deeper into the estate, the memories of her time with Amir came flooding back. She remembered the lavish dinners, the whispered promises, the way he had made her feel like the center of his world. But that world had been a lie, and now it was time to dismantle it piece by piece. Lila found Amir in his study, seated at a massive desk with papers and maps strewn across it. He didn't look surprised to see her. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he said, leaning back in his chair. Lila stepped forward, her eyes blazing with determination. "It's over, Amir. You can't escape this." Amir chuckled, shaking his head. "You think you've won? You've only scratched the surface of what I'm capable of." "That's where you're wrong," she replied, pulling a small recording device from her pocket. "Every word you say is being transmitted live. There's no one left to cover for you, no lies left to tell." His confident facade faltered, and for the first time, Lila saw fear in his eyes. Amir stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "You don't know what you're doing, Lila. If you destroy me, you destroy yourself. Do you really think the world will welcome you after this?" "I don't care," she said, her voice firm. "This isn't about me, it's about justice." Amir's expression darkened, and he took a step closer. "You think you're better than me? You're just as ruthless, just as willing to cross lines to get what you want." Lila held her ground. The difference is, I'm doing this for the people you've hurt. For the ones who couldn't fight back. The tension in the room was palpable as they stared each other down. Before Amir could make his next move, the sound of sirens echoed through the mountains. The authorities had arrived, their vehicles flooding the driveway with flashing lights. Amir's eyes widened in panic. "What have you done?" "I told you," Lila said, a small smile playing on her lips. "It's over." The door burst open, and armed officers stormed the room. Amir was quickly subdued, his protests falling on deaf ears. As they led him away, Lila felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had done it. The man who had once controlled her life was finally facing the consequences of his actions. In the days that followed, Lila watched as the world reacted to Amir's downfall. His name became synonymous with greed and corruption, his empire reduced to rubble. But for Lila, the real victory wasn't in his destruction. It was in her freedom. She had reclaimed her life, her voice, and her power. And for the first time in years, she felt truly at peace.